Last night, sparks flew on The Late Show when host Stephen Colbert tried to embarrass Attorney General Pam Bondi about her support for President Trump. What happened next shocked everyone. Bondi fired back with such force that the entire studio fell silent, and now the internet can't stop talking about it. The lights dimmed in The Late Show studio as the familiar music played. The audience clapped along, excited for another night of laughs with Stephen Colbert. Little did they know they were about to witness one of the most tense moments in late-night television history. "Tonight we have a very special guest," Colbert announced, his voice carrying a hint of mischief. "She's the current United States Attorney General and a loyal defender of our president. Please welcome Pam Bondi." The audience's applause was mixed with a few boos as Bondi walked onto the stage with a confident smile. She wore a smart blue suit and gave a friendly wave to the crowd before sitting across from Colbert. "Thank you for having me, Stephen," she said calmly. Colbert leaned forward in his chair. "Attorney General Bondi, it's interesting to have you here. Just last week, you defended the president's comments about border security, calling them necessary and appropriate. Yet 3 years ago, you called those exact same policies extreme. Care to explain the flip-flop?" The audience let out an "oh" as they sensed the trap Colbert had set. He smiled, clearly pleased with himself. Bondi didn't flinch. "Well, Stephen, I'm glad you brought that up because it gives me a chance to clear up some fake news." "Fake news?" Colbert raised an eyebrow. "So your own words from 3 years ago are fake news now?" "What's fake is how my words were twisted," Bondi replied. "If you look at my full statement, I was talking about a completely different situation. The media took just one sentence and made it seem like I said something I didn't." Colbert picked up some note cards. "I have the full quote right here, actually." "Please read it," Bondi challenged, looking unfazed. The audience grew quiet as Colbert began reading, but his confidence seemed to waver. The quote wasn't as damning as he'd suggested. He cleared his throat and tried to move on. "Let's talk about your defense of the president's recent executive order on immigration," Colbert said, quickly changing the subject. "I'm happy to," Bondi nodded. "But first, would you like to address how you just tried to mislead your audience with that quote?" The crowd gasped. Guests rarely called out Colbert so directly. "I wasn't misleading anyone," Colbert defended himself, his face growing slightly red. "I was simply pointing out a contradiction." "A contradiction that doesn't exist," Bondi countered. "This is exactly the problem with how news is reported today. People take things out of context to create drama and division." The tension in the studio was building. Colbert's usual quick wit seemed to falter as Bondi remained calm and prepared. "Let's move on to the election integrity laws you've supported," Colbert said. "Critics say these laws make it harder for certain communities to vote. How do you respond to that?" "I'm glad you asked," Bondi said, leaning forward, "because that's another example of misinformation. The laws I've supported actually make it easier to vote, but harder to cheat. Every eligible voter should have their voice heard and their vote should count. What exactly do you find wrong with preventing fraud?" "Well, studies show that voter fraud is extremely rare," Colbert replied. "Is that so?" Bondi raised an eyebrow. "Then you wouldn't mind if I share some actual data from the Justice Department?" Before Colbert could respond, Bondi pulled out her own set of notes and began reciting statistics about voting irregularities that had been investigated in recent years. "These numbers don't lie, Stephen," she said firmly, "and protecting the integrity of our elections shouldn't be a partisan issue." The audience was unusually quiet. This wasn't the fun, light-hearted interview they had expected. Colbert looked uncomfortable, and the usual laughter that followed his comments was noticeably absent. "We need to take a quick break," Colbert announced, clearly wanting a moment to regroup. "We'll be right back with more from Attorney General Pam Bondi." As the cameras stopped rolling, Colbert leaned over to one of his producers. The audience could see them having an intense discussion, while Bondi calmly sipped her water. When the show resumed, Colbert's tone had changed. He seemed determined to regain control of the interview. His eyes narrowed as he prepared his next question. Attorney General Bondi, you've been a strong defender of the president's policies on border security. But many have called these policies cruel and inhumane. How do you sleep at night knowing families have been affected by these decisions? The audience waited for Bondi's reaction to this direct attack. Would she lose her cool? Would she walk off the stage? Instead, Bondi looked Colbert directly in the eyes. You know, Stephen, that's a question I think about every single day. And I'd like to answer it honestly, if you'll let me finish without interrupting. Colbert nodded, though he looked skeptical. Border security isn't about being cruel. It's about following laws that have existed for decades under both Republican and Democratic presidents. It's about protecting both American citizens and the migrants who are being exploited by dangerous cartels. She paused, and the studio remained silent. I've visited the border myself. I've spoken with families affected on both sides. I've held children who were trafficked across the border. So when you ask how I sleep at night, I sleep knowing that I'm working to protect those children and prevent more suffering. The authenticity in her voice caught everyone off guard. Even Colbert seemed momentarily speechless. This wasn't the villain he had expected to interview. But what about the reports of poor conditions in detention facilities? Colbert pushed back, regaining his footing. Those conditions are exactly why I've been pushing Congress for more funding, Bondi replied. Your question shouldn't be directed at me. It should be directed at the lawmakers who refuse to provide the resources needed to improve those conditions while also securing our border. The audience murmured. This wasn't going according to plan. Bondi was turning Colbert's attacks back on him and doing it with facts that were hard to dispute. Colbert tried a different approach. Let's talk about your personal loyalty to the president. Many have suggested that as Attorney General, your first loyalty should be to the Constitution, not to one man. And they're absolutely right, Bondi agreed, surprising Colbert again. My oath is to the Constitution. Every decision I make is based on upholding the law, not pleasing any individual. If you have evidence suggesting otherwise, I'd love to hear it. Well, there was the time you defended the president's comments about the justice system being rigged, Colbert said. What I defended was his right to voice concerns, just as any American can, Bondi corrected. But if you look at my actions, not just my words taken out of context, you'll see that I've consistently upheld the independence of the Justice Department. The interview continued with Colbert growing increasingly frustrated while Bondi remained composed. The audience watched in stunned silence as the tables turned before their eyes. This wasn't the easy takedown of a Trump official they had expected. As the segment neared its end, Colbert prepared for his final question, one he was sure would finally trip up the Attorney General and give him the viral moment he wanted. Attorney General Bondi, Colbert leaned forward, his voice dropping to a serious tone. Last month, you defended the president when he claimed his opponents were enemies of the people. Don't you think that kind of language is dangerous in a democracy? The audience held their breath. This was the kind of question that had trapped other guests before. Bondi took a moment before answering. That's an important question, Stephen. Words matter, especially from leaders. Colbert smiled slightly, thinking he finally had her cornered. Which is exactly why I'd like to correct your question, Bondi continued. The president didn't call his opponents enemies of the people. He used that phrase specifically about news organizations that knowingly spread false information. And while we can debate whether that language is helpful, I think we should be accurate about what was actually said. But you're splitting hairs, Colbert interrupted. The effect is the same, creating division and possibly putting journalists in danger. Is it splitting hairs to care about accuracy? Bondi challenged. Isn't that what journalism is supposed to be about? And if we're concerned about dangerous language, shouldn't we be equally concerned when TV hosts mock and belittle? Half the country night after night? The audience grew uncomfortably quiet. No one had expected Bondi to turn the tables so directly. I don't mock half the country, Colbert defended himself. I make jokes about powerful people and policies I disagree with. That's comedy. And when those jokes consistently target one side and treat the other as heroes, what message does that send? Bondi asked. Don't you think that creates division too? Colbert's face flushed red. We're not here to talk about my show. Actually, I thought that's exactly what talk shows were for. Talking about anything important, Bondi replied calmly, including the role media plays in our divided country. A few audience members began to clap, surprising everyone, including themselves. Colbert looked shocked. Let's talk about something specific then, Colbert said, clearly trying to regain control. You recently claimed that social media companies are censoring conservative voices. Where's your proof? I'm glad you asked, Bondi replied. Just last week, my office received over 3,000 complaints from users who had posts removed or accounts suspended after sharing news articles critical of certain policies. We're currently investigating these cases. But that doesn't prove bias, Colbert argued. Maybe those posts violated platform rules. Which brings me to my point, Bondi nodded. Who makes those rules? Who decides what's misinformation versus unpopular opinion? Should tech companies have that much power over public discourse? Some audience members nodded in agreement. Others looked confused. This wasn't the easy takedown of a Trump official they had expected to enjoy. We're almost out of time, Colbert said, checking his watch. But before you go, I have to ask about your previous work as Florida's Attorney General, particularly your decision not to investigate Trump University after receiving a campaign donation from the Trump Foundation. Doesn't that show a conflict of interest? The audience gasped at the direct accusation. Surely this would be the question that finally tripped her up. Bondi's expression darkened for the first time. I was wondering when you'd bring that up. It's been debunked so many times, yet it keeps coming back like a zombie lie. Is it a lie that you received a $25,000 donation? Colbert pressed. What's a lie is the implied connection, Bondi fired back. My office received complaints about Trump University, yes, but we referred those cases to the New York Attorney General because that's where the case was centered. This was all documented and happened before any donation. The timeline simply doesn't support your insinuation. But the timing, Colbert started. The timing is exactly what clears me, Bondi interrupted. The donation came after the decision was already made. These facts are public record, Stephen. I'm surprised your researchers didn't brief you properly. The audience let out a collective, "Ooh!" This was getting intense. Let's be clear, Bondi continued, her voice now firm. I've spent my career fighting for victims of fraud. I would never ever drop an investigation because of a donation. That accusation questions my integrity, and I won't let it stand unchallenged. Colbert seemed taken aback by her forceful response. Well, I'm just asking the questions many people have. Are you sure you're not just repeating talking points without checking the facts? Bondi asked. Because that's exactly the kind of thing that undermines trust in media. The tension in the studio was electric. Colbert's usual smile had disappeared completely. We need to wrap up, he said abruptly. Actually, since you brought up my integrity, Bondi said, showing no sign of stopping, I'd like to finish answering your question. We're out of time, Colbert insisted. Funny how time runs out when your guest is making points you don't like, Bondi observed. Is this how all your interviews go? Several people in the audience actually laughed. Not at Bondi, but at Colbert's obvious discomfort. We have a schedule to keep, Colbert said firmly. But thank you for coming on the show tonight. Thank you for having me, Bondi replied. Though I notice you're cutting this segment shorter than usual. That's not true, Colbert said, clearly annoyed. The facts suggest otherwise, Bondi smiled. But let's check the tape afterward. As the show cut to commercial, the cameras caught Colbert's stunned expression. This wasn't how his interviews usually ended. Normally, he had the last word, the final joke. But Bondi had managed to leave him speechless. In the studio, the audience was buzzing with conversation. Some looked impressed by Bondi's performance, while others seemed disappointed that their favorite host had been outmaneuvered. When the show returned from break, Colbert seemed determined to regain control. "We're back with Attorney General Pam Bondi. Let's move to something lighter. I understand you're a dog lover." "I am," Bondi replied, seeming willing to change topics. "I have 2 rescue dogs at home." "Well, that's something we can agree on," Colbert said, forcing a smile. "I'm a dog person too." But just as it seemed the tension might ease, Colbert couldn't resist one more jab. "Though I'm surprised you care about rescues, given your administration's policies on—" "Really, Stephen?" Bondi cut him off. "We can't even talk about dogs without you making it political." "I'm just saying there seems to be a contradiction." "There you go again," Bondi shook her head. "This is exactly what Americans are tired of. Even conversations about pets have to be weaponized for political points." The audience stirred uncomfortably. This wasn't fun anymore. It was just awkward. "You know what?" Bondi said, placing her water glass down firmly. "I came on this show hoping for a fair conversation. I didn't expect you to agree with me, but I did expect basic respect." "I've been respectful," Colbert protested. "Have you?" Bondi asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, you've done nothing but try to trap me with gotcha questions and twist my words." She stood up, something guests almost never did before being dismissed. "Where are you going?" Colbert asked, looking genuinely surprised. "I think we're done here," Bondi replied. "But I want your viewers to know something important. If you want to understand what's happening in our country, don't just listen to late-night comedians. Read different news sources. Talk to people you disagree with. Make up your own minds." The audience was completely silent now. No one knew whether to clap or boo or just sit in shocked silence. "Well, folks," Colbert said, trying to salvage the moment, "it seems the Attorney General is leaving early. I guess tough questions aren't welcome in this administration after all." Bondi paused at the edge of the stage. "It's not the tough questions I object to, Stephen. It's the cheap shots and the refusal to let me answer those tough questions. There's a difference." With that, she walked off stage, leaving Colbert alone with a stunned audience and millions of viewers watching what would soon become the most viral segment in late-night television history. Behind the cameras, the show's producers were frantically signaling to Colbert. This was live TV and they needed to go to commercial, but Colbert just sat there, seemingly unsure what to do next. "We'll be right back," he finally said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. As the cameras cut away, the audience could see him turning to his staff with a mixture of anger and confusion on his face. What no one knew yet was that this confrontation was just the beginning. As soon as the show cut to commercial, chaos erupted backstage. Producers were rushing around, phones were ringing, and social media was exploding with clips of the exchange. "What just happened?" one producer asked, staring at his phone. "Twitter is going crazy." Colbert stood up, straightening his tie. "She was prepared. Too prepared. Like she knew exactly what I was going to ask." Meanwhile, Bondi was escorted to her dressing room where her team was already reviewing the footage on their phones. "You did great," her chief of staff said. "The hashtag #BondivsColbert is trending #1 already." Bondi sighed, taking off her microphone. "I didn't come here for a fight. I just wasn't going to let him push me around." Back on stage, Colbert was preparing for the next segment when a production assistant rushed up to him. "Sir, you need to see this," he said, showing Colbert his phone. The video of Bondi walking off stage had already been viewed over 1 million times in just minutes. Comments were flooding in from across the political spectrum. "We're live in 30 seconds," the floor director called out. Colbert took a deep breath. This wasn't how the show was supposed to go. He prided himself on controlling interviews, on having the last laugh. But tonight things had spiraled out of his control. When the show returned from commercial, viewers could tell something had changed. Colbert's usual confidence seemed shaken. "Well, folks, that was something," he said with a forced smile. "We'll be back with our next guest after this break." But the damage was done. By morning, the confrontation would be playing on every news channel in America. The next day, Bondi woke up to find herself the main topic on all the morning shows. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications since the interview. "Good morning, Madam Attorney General," her assistant said, entering her hotel room with a stack of newspapers. "You might want to see these." The headlines ranged from "Bondi Schools Colbert" to "Late Night Showdown, Ag Walks Off Set." Even media outlets that usually criticize the administration were covering the story, many noting Bondi's composure in the face of Colbert's increasingly hostile questions. Across town, in the late show offices, an emergency meeting was underway. "The clips have been viewed over 20 million times, the network executive said, facing a room of worried faces. "And the comments aren't exactly in our favor." Colbert sat at the head of the table reviewing the footage. "I wasn't that bad, was I? I was just asking tough questions." "The problem wasn't the questions," the show's director said gently. "It was that you didn't let her answer them. And when she did answer, you moved on without acknowledging her points." "That's not fair," Colbert protested, but even as he said it, he could see what they meant. The edited clips made him look petty and unprepared compared to Bondi's calm responses. "We need to address this," the executive continued. "The audience is divided. Many longtime viewers are defending you, but we're seeing comments from others who say they'll never watch again." Colbert nodded slowly. "So what do we do?" "You have two options," the executive replied. "Double down or apologize." Meanwhile, at the White House press briefing, reporters were asking about the confrontation. "The Attorney General was simply stating facts," the press secretary said. "If certain media figures can't handle that without getting upset, perhaps they should reconsider their approach." But not everyone was celebrating Bondi's performance. Critics pointed out that she had deflected some questions and that her answers weren't always complete. "Sure, she kept her cool," one analyst said on a cable news show. "But did she actually address the substance of Colbert's questions?" By that evening, the story had grown even bigger. Competing late-night hosts were making jokes about it. News programs were debating it, and ordinary Americans were taking sides. As Colbert prepared for that night's show, he knew he had to address what had happened. The question was how. The studio audience that evening was buzzing with excitement. Everyone was wondering what Colbert would say about the previous night's confrontation. When he walked out for his monologue, the applause was louder than usual. Thank you," Colbert said, waiting for the audience to settle down. "So, last night happened." The audience laughed nervously. "I've been doing this show for years, and I've interviewed hundreds of guests," Colbert continued. "Some interviews go great, some are a bit rocky. Last night's interview with Attorney General Bondi was, let's call it memorable." More laughter, slightly more relaxed this time. "Look, I'm a comedian. My job is to make you laugh while talking about the news. Sometimes that means asking tough questions. Sometimes it means making jokes at powerful people's expense. That's what I do." The audience applauded in support. "But," Colbert raised his hand, "my job is also to listen. And after watching the interview again, I realize I could have done a better job of that last night." The studio grew quiet. "I'm not saying I agree with Attorney General Bondi's positions. I don't. But I do respect that she came on this show knowing it wouldn't be friendly territory. That takes guts." Meanwhile, in Washington, Bondi was watching the show on her office TV, surrounded by her staff. "He's actually admitting he messed up," one aide said in surprise. Bondi shook her head. "He's doing damage control, but I appreciate the gesture. Back on The Late Show, Colbert was wrapping up his statement. "So here's what I'm going to do," he said. "I've invited Attorney General Bondi to come back on the show for a do-over. A real conversation where we both talk and listen. No gotcha. Questions. No walking off stage. Just two people with different views actually talking to each other." The audience applauded enthusiastically. "I don't know if she'll accept," Colbert admitted. "But the invitation is open." In her office, Bondi looked thoughtful. "He's smart. This makes him look reasonable, whether I accept or not." "Are you going to do it?" her chief of staff asked. "I'm thinking about it," Bondi replied. 3 days later, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. Bondi had accepted Colbert's invitation, and viewership estimates suggested it might be the most watched late-night segment in television history. This time, when Bondi walked on stage, the audience's reaction was different. More curious rather than hostile. Colbert greeted her with a handshake instead of a joke. "Thank you for coming back," he said sincerely. "Thank you for the invitation," Bondi replied. What followed wasn't the showdown many had expected. Instead, it was something almost unheard of in modern media. A genuine conversation between two people with opposing viewpoints. They disagreed on most issues, sometimes strongly. But this time, each let the other finish their thoughts. When Colbert made a joke, Bondi laughed. When Bondi made a point Colbert hadn't considered, he acknowledged it. At one point, Colbert asked about immigration policy, a topic that had caused tension in their previous encounter. "We disagree on the solutions," Bondi said after explaining her position, "but I think we actually agree that the current situation isn't working for anyone. Not for American citizens, not for legal immigrants, and certainly not for children. Caught in the middle." "That's a fair assessment," Colbert admitted, looking surprised. By the end of the interview, something remarkable had happened. Neither had changed the other's mind, but both had demonstrated that political opponents could have a respectful dialogue. As the segment ended, the audience gave them both a standing ovation. "That was unexpected," Colbert said as the cameras cut away. "In a good way, I hope," Bondi replied. The next day, the second interview went just as viral as the first, but for entirely different reasons. News outlets praised it as a model for political discourse and a rare moment of civility in divided times. The president tweeted his approval of Bondi's performance, while political commentators from across the spectrum noted how refreshing it was to see a genuine exchange of ideas. 2 weeks later, the impact of the Colbert-Bondi confrontation was still being felt. Ratings for The Late Show had actually increased, with viewers curious to see if the more balanced approach would continue. Other talk show hosts were taking note, some adjusting their own interview styles. In Washington, Bondi found that the interviews had raised her profile considerably. People who had previously dismissed her as just another partisan now recognized her ability to communicate effectively across political lines. During a cabinet meeting, the president acknowledged her handling of the situation. "You turned what could have been a disaster into a win," he told her. "Not just for us, but for showing how these conversations should happen." 6 months later, a political science professor at Georgetown published a research paper analyzing the Colbert-Bondi effect on public discourse. The paper noted a measurable decrease in hostile interruptions during political interviews following the viral confrontation. The confrontation that began as an attempt to embarrass had transformed into something neither Colbert nor Bondi could have predicted. A moment that reminded Americans that behind political differences were actual people, capable of listening to each other despite their disagreements. As for Colbert and Bondi themselves, they never became friends. Their political views remained as different as ever, but they had gained something perhaps more valuable: mutual respect. On the first anniversary of their viral confrontation, Bondi appeared on The Late Show once more. This time there was no tension, no viral clips, no social media explosion, just a substantive conversation about important issues. At the end of the interview, Colbert asked her a final question. Looking back at our first encounter, what do you think we've all learned? Bondi thought for a moment. That it's possible to disagree without being enemies. That listening doesn't mean surrendering your views. And that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just let someone else finish their sentence. The audience applauded as Colbert nodded in agreement. I couldn't have said it better myself, he replied. And trust me, that's not something I admit often. As the credits rolled, viewers witnessed something that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. Stephen Colbert and Pam Bondi, laughing together, two public figures who had turned a confrontation into a conversation, and in doing so, showed a divided nation that maybe, just maybe, there was another way forward.